The rain tapped steadily against the attic window, a soft, rhythmic sound that accompanied Emma and Jack as they sorted through years of forgotten possessions. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by a lone bulb that flickered faintly. The space smelled of aged wood and memories, and the couple moved carefully, stepping around creaky floorboards and teetering stacks of cardboard boxes. This feels like opening a time capsule, Emma said, pulling out an old photo album and brushing off the dust. She chuckled as she held up a picture of Jack in his 20s, his hair longer and his smile a little cockier. Look at you. Who gave you permission to look this smug? Jack leaned over to see, his knees cracking as he crouched. What can I say? I was a heartthrob, he replied with a grin, but the playful gleam in his eye quickly faded. You know, this is probably a terrible idea. We should have just hired someone to clean this out. My back's gonna pay for this tomorrow. Emma rolled her eyes. You've been saying that since you turned 40. You're only 55, Jack. If we stop moving, we'll turn into one of these old boxes. As Jack continued to grumble good-naturedly, Emma's hand brushed against something smooth and cool beneath a pile of outdated magazines. She tugged at it, pulling free a small leather-bound book with a cracked spine. It felt oddly out of place amid the chaos of the attic. She turned it over in her hands, brushing off a layer of grime, and flipped it open. The handwriting was unmistakably Jack's, strong, looping letters she hadn't seen in years. What's this? Emma asked, holding the book up for Jack to see. He glanced over and froze. His playful demeanor shifted, replaced by a flicker of unease. Where'd you find that? Under these magazines. Is this yours? Emma flipped through the pages, her brow furrowing as she skimmed the text. It's a diary? Your diary? Jack took a hesitant step forward. Yeah, I guess so. From a long time ago. I thought I got rid of that. Why would you throw this away? Emma's voice softened as she read one of the entries aloud. Our first real date. Emma wore that blue dress that made her eyes sparkle, and I couldn't stop staring at her. She looked up, her expression warm. You wrote about me. Jack scratched the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. I didn't think you'd ever find it. It was just something I did back then, to clear my head. Emma ignored his embarrassment, flipping through more pages. You wrote about everything. Our dreams, plans. Here's one about the house we wanted to build. A little cabin by the lake with a porch big enough for 2 rocking chairs. She glanced up at him. Do you remember that? Jack sighed and sat down on an old trunk, the creak of the wood loud in the quiet attic. Of course, I remember. But that was decades ago, Emma. We had kids. We had bills. Life happened. That dream wasn't practical. But you wrote about it like it was real, Jack, she pressed, holding up the diary. Like it was something you could reach out and touch. It mattered to you. Jack leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. It did matter, at the time, but we had bigger priorities. A lakeside cabin doesn't put food on the table or send kids to college. Emma frowned, her fingers running over the worn leather cover. I don't think we stopped dreaming, Jack. I think we just forgot how. There was a pause, the rain filling the silence between them. Jack finally spoke, his voice low. Let me see that. Emma handed him the diary, and he flipped through it with a mix of nostalgia and trepidation. His eyes lingered on certain entries, his lips tightening as he read. I can't believe I wrote all this, he muttered. It's beautiful, Emma said. You were so naive, he cut in. I was going to say romantic, she replied, her tone firm. You were someone who believed in us, Jack, who dreamed big. Jack chuckled, though there was little humor in it. And now I'm the guy who worries about mortgage rates and back pain. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. You're still that guy, Jack, the one who dreamed about rocking chairs and sunsets by the lake. He's in there somewhere. Maybe we just need to wake him up. Jack looked at her, his eyes searching hers. What are you saying? I'm saying, why not now? The kids are grown. We've saved. What's stopping us from building that lakeside home? Jack stared at her, dumbfounded. You're serious? Why not? It doesn't have to be big or fancy. Just ours. A place where we can sit and watch the water and remember who we were. Jack shook his head, his skepticism evident. Emma, it's not that simple. Buying land, building a house, it's expensive, stressful. And worth it, she interrupted. You wrote about it like it was worth it. Jack sighed, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He glanced back at the diary, his fingers brushing over the faded ink. It's been a long time since I let myself think about things like this, he admitted. So think about it now, Emma urged. What's the harm in dreaming again? Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped to the last page of the diary. His gaze lingered there, his expression unreadable. Emma tilted her head, curious. What is it? Nothing, he said quickly, closing the diary and setting it aside. Let's go back downstairs. This attic is giving me allergies. Emma studied him, sensing something unspoken, but she decided not to press. As they climbed down the attic stairs, she glanced back at the diary, sitting alone on the trunk. The idea of the lakeside home had taken root in her heart, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the diary, something Jack wasn't telling her, and she was determined to find out what. This detailed opening chapter sets the stage for the intrigue to unfold, introducing emotional stakes, nostalgic reflections, and subtle tension between Emma and Jack. The diary becomes not just a symbol of their forgotten dreams, but also a mysterious thread pulling them into a journey that's about to take unexpected turns. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee as Emma sat at the table, the old diary open before her. A yellow notepad lay beside it, covered in scribbled ideas and sketches of a house she could barely picture but already loved. Outside, the rain had stopped and the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting soft light across the pages of Jack's handwriting. Jack shuffled in, still in his pajamas, scratching his head as he poured himself a cup of coffee. You're up early, he said, eyeing her suspiciously. That's never a good sign. Emma looked up with a playful smile. I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Jack took a cautious sip of his coffee and sat across from her. Uh-oh, what are you scheming now? She slid the notepad toward him. Just a little brainstorming. He glanced at the sketches and frowned. Is this a house? It's not just any house, Emma said, her voice tinged with excitement. It's our house, by the lake. Jack leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Emma, we talked about this. It's a nice idea, but it's not practical. It's not practical here, she countered, tapping her pen on the diary. This house, this neighborhood, it made sense when we were raising kids, but we don't need all this space anymore. We could sell this place, downsize, and use the money to make our dream a reality. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. You make it sound so easy. It could be, Emma pressed, leaning forward. We've always been careful with money, Jack. We've worked hard for decades. Don't you think we deserve this? To finally do something just for us? Jack studied her for a moment, his expression softening. You're really serious about this, aren't you? I am, she said, her voice firm. This isn't just about the house. It's about us. When was the last time we did something adventurous? Something that scared us a little? Every time I look at our retirement account, Jack muttered, earning a laugh from Emma. I mean it, she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. I think we need this, Jack, a fresh start, a chance to remember who we were before life got so complicated. Jack looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing against hers. What if it's not everything we imagined? What if we fail? Emma's grip tightened. What if it's better? Jack exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You don't give up, do you? Not when it comes to something this important. He nodded, a glint of the old Jack shining through. All right, let's at least look at some properties. But I'm not making any promises. Emma grinned, her excitement bubbling over. You won't regret this. The search begins. 2 days later, Emma and Jack found themselves driving through winding country roads, the GPS occasionally barking directions that Jack ignored in favor of his own instincts. You know, the whole point of GPS is to follow it, Emma teased as he made yet another unadvised turn. Jack smirked. I don't trust that thing. Besides, this way's faster. Emma rolled her eyes but said nothing, too busy gazing out the window at the rolling hills and glimmers of sunlight on water in the distance. The countryside was breathtaking, and she felt a thrill of anticipation with every mile. Their first stop was a pristine lakeside property with a modern house already built on it. The realtor, a chipper woman in her 40s named Linda, greeted them warmly and led them inside. The house was beautiful, sleek, polished, and completely devoid of the charm Emma had envisioned. It's nice, Emma said diplomatically, glancing at Jack, who was inspecting the kitchen. Nice? Linda repeated, her smile faltering. It's a state-of-the-art design with all the latest features. You won't find anything better in this price range. Jack nodded appreciatively. It's definitely impressive. Emma sighed. But it's not us, Linda blinked. I'm sorry? It's just not what we're looking for, Emma explained. We want something with character, something we can make our own. Linda's smile became fixed. Well, I'm sure we can find something to suit your needs. The cabin. After several uninspiring viewings, Linda finally took them to a more remote location. The drive was longer, the roads rougher, and the GPS had long since lost signal. But Emma's excitement grew as they neared the lake. When they arrived, she gasped. The cabin was small and weathered, its wooden exterior gray with age, but it sat on a perfect stretch of land overlooking the water. Tall pines framed the property, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The lake itself sparkled in the afternoon sun, a serene expanse of blue that seemed to stretch forever. It needs some work, Linda admitted, eyeing the sagging porch and overgrown yard. But the bones are solid, and the location? Well, you can't beat it. Emma stepped out of the car, her heart pounding. She could already picture herself sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise. Jack, this is it. Jack frowned, crossing his arms as he studied the cabin. It's a fixer-upper, all right? Exactly, Emma said, her eyes shining. It's perfect. Jack hesitated. I don't know, Emma. This is more than a little work. It's a lot of work and a lot of money. Emma turned to him, her expression pleading. But can't you see it? The potential? This place could be everything we've ever dreamed of. Jack looked at her, then at the cabin, then back at her. You really love it, don't you? I do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Well, I guess we'd better see what it's going to take to make it ours. As Linda showed them around the property, Emma wandered off, drawn to the edge of the lake. The water lapped gently at the shore, and she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Something about this place felt familiar, as though she had been here before. She knelt to pick up a smooth, flat stone and skipped it across the water. As it bounced once, twice, 3 times, she noticed something glinting in the shallows, a small metal object half buried in the sand. Curious, she waded in and pulled it out. It was an old key, its surface tarnished but still intact. Emma turned it over in her hands, a strange sense of anticipation stirring within her. Emma, Jack's voice called from the porch. What are you doing? She slipped the key into her pocket and turned back, smiling. Just skipping stones. As she rejoined Jack, her heart raced. She didn't know why, but the key felt important, like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. For now, she kept it to herself, not wanting to dampen Jack's growing enthusiasm. Together, they stood on the porch, gazing out at the lake. For the first time in years, Emma felt the spark of something new, a dream, a mystery, and a journey just beginning. It wasn't anything the Johnson family could easily pinpoint, no sudden, dramatic events that screamed of danger. Instead, it was a slow, creeping shift in atmosphere. The air felt heavier, carrying with it a subtle chill, and the walls seemed to groan with the weight of unspoken secrets. Lily was the first to notice. She woke one night to the faint sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was Ethan talking in his sleep. She threw a pillow at the wall, annoyed. Ethan, shut up! The whispers stopped for a moment, but just as she was drifting back to sleep, they began again, soft, unintelligible murmurs, as if someone was just outside her room. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up, straining to hear. Ethan? She called. The house responded with silence. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as she padded out into the hallway. The whispers grew louder as she neared the attic stairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached for the doorknob. Lily? Her mother's voice startled her. Susan stood at the end of the hall, her robe wrapped tightly around her. Mom, do you hear that? Lily whispered. Susan frowned, listening for a moment. Hear what? Lily opened her mouth to respond, but the whispers had stopped. She turned back to the attic door. It sounded like someone talking. Susan's frown deepened. It's just an old house. They creak and settle at night. Come on, back to bed. Lily hesitated but followed her mother. As they walked away, neither noticed the faint shadow that flickered beneath the attic door. The next morning, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with a frustrated scowl. This stupid thing keeps freezing, he grumbled, shaking the device. Maybe because you spend every waking second on it, Lily teased, grabbing a slice of toast from the counter. It's not funny, Ethan snapped. I tried taking pictures of the album last night, and now my phone's acting like it's possessed. Susan, carrying a basket of laundry, paused mid-step. Wait, what do you mean? Ethan held up his phone. Every time I pointed the camera at the album, it died. The screen went black, and then it restarted. It's like the thing doesn't want to be photographed. That's ridiculous, Susan said, though her tone lacked conviction. It's probably just a coincidence. Mark entered the kitchen, looking harried. What's going on? Ethan's phone is cursed, Lily said, rolling her eyes dramatically. It's not cursed, Ethan snapped. There's something wrong with that album, and you all know it. Mark exchanged a worried glance with Susan. We need to be careful, he said. I don't want anyone messing with the album until we figure out what we're dealing with. Fine by me, Ethan muttered, shoving his phone into his pocket. That thing's creepy anyway. Later that evening, Susan was tidying up the living room when she noticed the album sitting on the coffee table. She hesitated, then picked it up, flipping through the pages. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw a new photo that hadn't been there before. It showed their family, Mark, Susan, Lily, and Ethan, sitting at the dinner table. The image was eerily perfect, capturing not just their likeness, but their exact expressions and positions from earlier that night. Susan felt a chill run down her spine. Mark, she called, her voice trembling. He appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. What is it? Look at this, she said, holding up the album. Mark's face went pale as he studied the photo. This isn't possible. We didn't take any pictures tonight. I know, Susan whispered, but there we are. Mark set the album down as if it burned to the touch. This is getting out of hand. We need answers. The next day, Mark returned to Dr. Whitaker's office. The historian greeted him with an eager yet wary expression, as if he had been expecting him. Ah, Mr. Johnson, Whitaker said, I've been doing some research on your grandmother. Mark placed the album on Whitaker's desk. Before we talk about Evelyn, I need you to explain this. He flipped to the photo of the family at the dinner table. Whitaker adjusted his glasses, studying the image closely. When was this taken? It wasn't, Mark said. That's the problem. Whitaker's hands trembled slightly as he closed the album. I've seen strange artifacts in my time, but nothing like this. Your grandmother was involved in something unconventional. I found references to her brother Thomas in the town archives. He was said to be a genius, but his ideas were dangerous. What kind of ideas? Mark asked, leaning forward. Time manipulation, Whitaker said. The ability to not just observe the past, but alter it. He claimed to have created a device that could capture moments in time. But such power comes with a cost. What kind of cost? Mark pressed. Whitaker hesitated. The stories are vague, but they suggest that tampering with time can have unintended consequences. The fabric of reality is delicate. If this album is tied to Thomas's experiments, then you and your family are in grave danger. That night, the whispers returned. Lily woke to find her room bathed in an eerie, flickering light. She sat up, heart pounding, and saw the album lying open on her desk, even though she was certain it had been downstairs. Ethan, this isn't funny, she shouted. Her brother's voice came groggily from his room. What are you talking about? Lily crept toward the desk. Her eyes fixed on the album. A new photo had appeared, this one showing the attic stairs. At the top stood a figure shrouded in shadow. Mom? Dad! Lily screamed. Mark and Susan burst into the room moments later, followed by Ethan. What's going on? Mark demanded. Lily pointed to the album. It was on my desk, and now there's this picture. Mark picked up the album, his hands shaking. He stared at the photo, his face a mask of fear. We're locking this away, he said. Right now. Mark hid the album in a locked cabinet in the study, but even then, the family couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The house creaked and groaned as if alive, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ethan, unable to resist his curiosity, snuck into the study late one night. He unlocked the cabinet and retrieved the album, flipping through its pages with a mix of fear and fascination. He found a photo of himself, standing in front of the house with a strange, vacant expression. The caption below read, "What is taken may yet return." Ethan dropped the album in shock. The room spun, and for a moment, He thought he saw a figure standing in the corner, watching him. Ethan? Susan's voice called from the hallway. He slammed the cabinet shut, shoving the key back into his pocket. It's nothing, Mom, he said, his voice unsteady. But deep down, he knew it wasn't nothing. The album had shown him something he couldn't explain, something that felt like a warning or a promise. The cabin was finally beginning to take shape. Fresh paint coated the walls, the sagging porch had been reinforced, and the overgrown yard was slowly transforming into a serene space overlooking the glistening lake. But as the physical changes to the cabin progressed, the emotional landscape between Emma and Jack grew more complicated. Jack had taken to working long hours on the project, focusing on fixing the plumbing and repairing the foundation, while Emma spent her time decorating and digging into the mystery of the old key she'd found. Both were so preoccupied with their respective tasks that they spoke less and less, each wrapped up in their thoughts. One evening, Emma sat on the couch, flipping through Jack's diary again. The words on the pages seemed different now, heavier, as if they carried more weight than they had before. She came across an entry she hadn't noticed during her previous readings. The cabin by the lake will be a place to start over, a place where we can heal from everything we've been running from. But I'm afraid that even here, the past will catch up with us. Emma frowned, rereading the entry. The tone was darker, more reflective than the other passages. Heal from what? She muttered under her breath. What's that? Jack's voice startled her, and she quickly closed the diary. He was standing in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, his face tired but curious. Nothing, Emma said, slipping the diary onto the coffee table. Just reading. Jack eyed her, his brow furrowing. You've been glued to that thing lately, starting to think you love it more than me. Emma forced a smile. Don't be ridiculous. Jack stepped closer, sitting down beside her. Emma, if there's something bothering you, just say it. She hesitated, glancing at the diary, then back at him. Jack, do you remember writing anything strange in here? Anything that didn't feel like your words? Jack leaned back, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. What do you mean? Emma picked up the diary, flipping to the darker entry. She held it out to him. Does this sound like something you would write? Jack scanned the page, his expression unreadable. I mean, maybe. It's been years, Emma. I don't remember every word I wrote. But why would you write about being afraid? Emma pressed. What were you running from? Jack closed the diary and set it aside. It doesn't matter. Whatever it was, it's ancient history. But, Emma, he said firmly, cutting her off, let it go. The finality in his tone sent a chill through her. She nodded, though the unease in her chest only deepened. Jack had always been steady, unflappable, but now she could sense something lurking beneath his calm exterior. Something he wasn't telling her. The discovery. The next morning, Emma decided to clean out the crawl space beneath the cabin. It had been bothering her ever since the inspector mentioned it during their initial walkthrough. Armed with a flashlight and a pair of gloves, she squeezed into the dark, narrow space, coughing as dust filled the air. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but something compelled her to keep going. The faint smell of mildew hung in the air, and the ground beneath her hands was cold and damp. As she crawled deeper, her flashlight beam landed on a wooden box tucked into a corner. The box was old, the wood warped and cracked, but it was still intact. Emma's heart raced as she dragged the box out into the light. She sat back on her heels, staring at it, her hands trembling. She pried the lid open and gasped. Inside were faded letters, tied together with a fraying ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink smudged but still legible. Emma carefully unfolded one of the letters, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. To whoever finds this, my name is Thomas Grayson. This cabin was meant to be a refuge for my wife, Lillian, and me, a place where we could leave behind the pain of our past. But fate had other plans. Emma read on, her pulse quickening with every word. The letters revealed that Thomas and Lillian had purchased the cabin years ago, hoping to rebuild their lives after a personal tragedy. But as they worked on the property, strange things began to happen. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Thomas's final letter sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Lillian is gone now. I can't explain how or why, but the cabin took her, and I fear it will take me too. To anyone who finds these letters, leave this place. Do not try to make it your own. It will only destroy you. Emma sat frozen, the letter clutched in her hands. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Thomas Grayson? What had happened to Lillian? And why had the cabin's history been hidden from them? Confronting Jack. That evening, Emma confronted Jack as he worked on installing new light fixtures in the living room. Jack, we need to talk. Jack looked up, immediately sensing the tension in her voice. What's wrong? Emma held up the letters. I found these in the crawl space. Jack set down his tools, wiping his hands on his jeans. What are they? Letters from the previous owner, Emma said, her voice trembling. Jack, he wrote about terrible things happening here. About his wife disappearing, he said the cabin was cursed. Jack stared at her, his jaw tightening. Emma, come on, you don't really believe that, do you? Read them, she insisted, thrusting the letters toward him. This isn't just some ghost story, Jack. There's something wrong with this place. Jack took the letters, glancing over them. His expression darkened as he read, but when he finished, he shook his head. This guy was probably just crazy, or grieving. People say all kinds of things when they're desperate. Emma stepped closer, her voice rising. And what about the diary? The strange entries you don't remember writing? Jack, something is going on here, and we can't just ignore it. Jack met her gaze, his frustration evident. What do you want me to do, Emma? Tear down the cabin? Run away because of some letters from a guy we've never met? I want you to take this seriously, Emma said, her voice breaking. Because I'm scared, Jack. I'm scared that this dream of ours is turning into a nightmare. Jack softened, reaching for her hand. Emma, I know this hasn't been easy. But this place, it's just a cabin. Whatever happened here before, it doesn't have to define what it becomes for us. Emma pulled her hand away, her heart aching. What if it already has? An ominous night. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore echoing in her ears. Jack was snoring softly beside her, oblivious to her turmoil. She got up and went to the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she sat in the rocking chair. The lake was eerily still, the moonlight casting long shadows across the water. As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard a faint creaking sound behind her. She turned, expecting to see Jack, but the doorway was empty. The creaking continued, growing louder until the rocking chair beside her began to move on its own. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who's there? She whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response. The chair stopped moving, and the silence that followed was deafening. Emma bolted back inside, locking the door behind her. She stood there, her heart pounding, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain. The cabin was keeping its secrets, and it wasn't done with her yet. The cabin sat silent in the misty morning, a chill in the air that seeped through the cracks of its newly painted walls. Emma stirred her coffee in the small kitchen, her mind racing with thoughts of the letters, the mysterious diary entries, and the rocking chair's eerie movements. Jack had dismissed it all as coincidence, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was alive, watching, waiting. Jack entered the kitchen, yawning as he rubbed the back of his neck. Morning, he mumbled, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Emma glanced at him, hesitating. She wanted to bring it up again, the strange occurrences, the history of the cabin, but Jack's weary expression stopped her. He looked like a man carrying too much already. Morning, she replied quietly. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Jack leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, and finally broke the tension. You're still thinking about those letters, aren't you? Emma nodded. How could I not? Jack, that man said his wife disappeared, that he thought the cabin. Emma, Jack interrupted, setting his mug down with a thud. We've been over this. There's a logical explanation for all of it. The letters, the diary, the rocking chair. None of it means anything. It's just noise. Emma's frustration bubbled to the surface. Noise? Jack, I saw that chair move. I felt it. And those letters, they're not just noise. They're a warning. A warning about what? Jack's voice rose, his own patience fraying. Ghosts? Curses? Come on, Emma. We're too old for fairy tales. Then why do you keep avoiding the diary? Emma shot back. Why won't you admit that you don't remember writing some of those entries? Jack froze, his face a mix of guilt and defiance. He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, shaking his head. Emma stepped closer, her voice softening. Jack, please, talk to me. What aren't you telling me? Jack's secret. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair as he sank into a chair at the kitchen table. He stared into his coffee, as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and hesitant. When I wrote in that diary, Emma, it wasn't just about our dreams. It was an escape. An escape? Emma echoed, sitting across from him. Jack nodded. Back then, I was dealing with a lot. Work was stressful, money was tight, and I felt like I was failing you, failing us. Writing in that diary was my way of holding on to hope. But sometimes, he trailed off, his eyes distant. Sometimes what? Emma prompted gently. Jack hesitated, then met her gaze. Sometimes it felt like I wasn't the one writing, like the words were coming from somewhere else. Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. Jack, that doesn't make sense. I know it doesn't, he said quickly. But it's the truth. There were nights I'd wake up and find entries I didn't remember writing. And some of the things I wrote, they scared me. Why didn't you tell me? Emma whispered, hurt flickering across her face. Jack looked away. Because I didn't want you to think I was losing my mind. I convinced myself it didn't matter, that it was just stress or sleepwalking. And eventually, I stopped writing altogether. Emma leaned back, hearing the weight of his confession sinking in. Jack, this cabin, it's connected to the diary somehow. I don't know how or why, but it is, and we can't just ignore that. Jack rubbed his temples, his frustration evident. What do you want me to do, Emma? Burn the cabin down? Sell it? We've put everything into this place. I don't know, Emma admitted, her voice trembling. But we have to figure this out, together. Jack nodded reluctantly. All right, what's the plan? Hash an unexpected clue. Later that day, Emma decided to revisit the crawlspace where she'd found the letters. Jack insisted on joining her this time, armed with a flashlight and a determined expression. Together, they crawled into the dark, musty space, the sound of their breathing echoing off the narrow walls. Emma pointed to the spot where she'd discovered the box. It was right there. Maybe there's more. Jack began carefully searching the area, his flashlight sweeping over the dirt and cobwebs. After a few minutes, his beam landed on something shiny. What's this? He muttered, reaching for it. He pulled out a small, tarnished locket on a delicate chain. Emma leaned closer, her heart racing. Jack opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph of a woman with dark, piercing eyes. On the opposite side, an engraving read, Lillian Grayson. It's her, Emma whispered. Thomas's wife. Jack frowned, examining the locket. What do you think it means? I don't know, Emma said, her voice trembling, but we need to find out. Ash, a visit to the library. The next day, Emma and Jack drove into town and visited the local library, hoping to uncover more about the Graysons and the cabin's history. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Winthrop, was more than happy to help. Oh, yes, Mrs. Winthrop said, adjusting her glasses. The Graysons were well known around here. Tragic story, really. What happened to them? Emma asked, her curiosity piqued. Mrs. Winthrop pursed her lips. Well, Thomas and Lillian bought that cabin after they lost their baby, a little boy who died of pneumonia. They thought the lake would be a place to heal, but it only seemed to bring them more heartache. What kind of heartache? Jack asked. Lillian disappeared one night, Mrs. Winthrop said, her voice lowering. Some people think she ran off, but Thomas swore she would never leave him. Others, well, they say the cabin took her. The cabin? Emma repeated, her stomach tightening. Mrs. Winthrop nodded. There's a legend around here. They say the lake is cursed, that it claims those who bring their sorrow to its shores. That's just a story, Jack said quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. Perhaps, Mrs. Winthrop said with a shrug, but Thomas disappeared not long after Lillian. Some say he went looking for her. Others believe he followed her into the lake. The warning. That night, back at the cabin, Emma couldn't sleep. She sat on the porch, the locket clutched in her hand, staring out at the lake. The water was eerily still, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight. Lillian, Emma whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. If you're out there, please, tell me what happened. The wind picked up suddenly, rustling the trees and sending a chill down her spine. The rocking chair beside her began to creak, moving slowly back and forth. Emma froze, her heart pounding. A faint whisper seemed to drift on the wind, too soft to make out, but unmistakably there. Emma leaned forward, her voice trembling. What do you want? The whisper grew louder, resolving into a single word, leave. Emma stumbled back, dropping the locket. She rushed inside, slamming the door behind her, her chest heaving with fear. Jack found her in the living room, her face pale. Emma, what's wrong? She looked at him, her eyes wide. It's not just a story, Jack. The cabin, the lake, it's trying to warn us. We're not supposed to be here. Jack wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. We'll figure this out, Emma, I promise. But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the growing unease in his own heart. Something about the cabin was changing, and he feared it might be too late to turn back. The morning air was crisp as the sun rose over the lake, casting golden light across the still water. The cabin was nearly complete, its fresh paint gleaming in the early light. Emma stood on the porch, clutching a steaming mug of coffee, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The locket rested in her pocket, a constant, silent weight against her thigh. Jack emerged from the cabin, his footsteps creaking on the newly reinforced boards. You're up early, he said, handing her a second blanket. Cold? Not really, Emma replied, her voice distant. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders anyway. I couldn't sleep. Jack leaned against the railing beside her, looking out at the lake. Still thinking about last night? Emma nodded. It's hard not to. I can't stop hearing that word, leave. What if it's right, Jack? What if we're not supposed to be here? Jack sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Emma, I know this has been strange, but we've come too far to walk away now. This place, it's ours, and we're not letting some spooky stories chase us out. Emma frowned, her fingers tightening around her mug. You didn't hear it, Jack. You didn't feel it. Jack reached out, placing a hand on her arm. Hey, we're in this together. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out, but we're not running. The final piece. Determined to confront the cabin's secrets, Emma and Jack decided to finish the last major task, rebuilding the attic. It had been left untouched during the renovations, its old beams sagging and its floorboards covered in dust and debris. As they worked, Emma noticed a loose plank in the corner. Her curiosity piqued. She pried it up, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and its pages yellowed with age. Jack, she called, holding up the journal. Look at this. Jack set down his hammer and crossed the room, taking the journal from her hands. He flipped it open, his brow furrowing as he scanned the first few pages. It's Thomas's, he said quietly. Emma leaned over his shoulder, her heart racing. What does it say? Jack read aloud. I've tried to rebuild, to find peace, but the lake won't let me. It whispers to me at night, calling me to its depths. Lillian heard it too. She said it was trying to tell her something, but I couldn't understand. Then she disappeared. And now, I fear I'm next. Jack closed the journal, his expression grim. This isn't just a story, is it? Emma shook her head. No, it's not. That night, Emma couldn't shake the words in the journal. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore echoing in her ears. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a heartbeat. She turned to Jack, who was sleeping soundly beside her. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, grabbing a flashlight and the locket as she made her way outside. The cool night air hit her skin as she stepped onto the porch, the moonlight illuminating the water. The lake seemed to beckon her, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. Clutching the locket, Emma walked toward the shore, her bare feet sinking into the damp sand. Emma! The whisper came from nowhere and everywhere at once, soft yet insistent. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who's there? She called, her voice trembling. Emma. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, filled with both sorrow and urgency. Emma's grip on the locket tightened. Lillian? She whispered. The water rippled, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw a figure standing in the shallows. A woman with dark, piercing eyes, her face pale and ethereal. Emma took a step forward, her heart pounding. What do you want? She asked. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the cabin. Protect him, the voice said, barely audible over the sound of the water. Don't let it take him. Emma's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Take who? But the figure was gone, and the lake returned to its stillness. The confrontation. Emma rushed back to the cabin, her heart racing. She found Jack in the living room, staring at the journal, his face pale. Jack, she said, out of breath. I saw her. I saw Lillian. Jack looked up, his eyes wide. What are you talking about? She was at the lake, Emma said, grabbing his arm. She said it's trying to take you. We have to leave, Jack. Now. Jack shook his head. Emma, calm down. You're scaring yourself. There's no one out there. I'm not imagining this, Emma insisted. The lake, it's alive, Jack. It's been watching and waiting for us to finish the cabin. Don't you see? It's using us. Jack stood, his jaw set. Using us for what? Emma hesitated, the truth dawning on her. To replace them. To finish what they couldn't. Jack stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head. This is ridiculous. We're not leaving, Emma. This is our home. No, Emma said, her voice firm. It's not. It never was. The breaking point. Their argument was interrupted by a sudden, deafening crash. The floor beneath them shook as if something massive had struck the cabin. Jack grabbed Emma, pulling her toward the door. What the hell was that? He shouted. Emma's eyes darted around the room. It's the lake. It's trying to trap us. Jack ran to the window, peering outside. The water had risen, creeping closer to the cabin, its surface churning violently. That's impossible, he muttered. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Emma grabbed Jack's hand, her voice trembling. We have to go. Now. Jack hesitated, torn between disbelief and the undeniable terror of the moment. Finally, he nodded. All right, let's go. A narrow escape. They grabbed what they could and ran to the car, the ground beneath them trembling as if the earth itself was alive. The lake's waters surged closer, waves crashing against the porch as they sped down the dirt road. Emma glanced back, her heart sinking as she saw the cabin's outline fading into the distance. It had been their dream, their sanctuary, but now it was a prison they had narrowly escaped. Jack drove in silence, his grip on the wheel tight. Finally, he spoke. Do you think it's over? Emma shook her head. I don't know, but we're not going back. A new beginning. Months later, Emma and Jack settled into a small, cozy house far from the lake. The diary and letters remained packed away, relics of a story they were still trying to understand. One evening, as they sat on their new porch, watching the sunset, Emma reached for Jack's hand. Do you think it's possible to start over? She asked softly. Jack looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. If we've learned anything, it's that we have to try. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The lake's whispers were gone, but its lessons remained. Dreams, she realized, were only worth pursuing if they didn't come at the cost of everything else. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like they were truly home.